Okay. Um, as I mentioned, Nutrition and Recovery is my home group, my private practice in West LA, and Wise Mind Nutrition is the app and the blog, which I highly recommend checking out. We do work in substance use disorder, eating disorder, and mental health, and I don't have any dietary preferences that I need to disclose. Okay, I want to start off by just giving a shout out to Australia. I've just been so impressed with the work that's happening in Australia related to mental health and nutrition, and particularly, promoting the role of the registered dietitian. This editorial says mental health is every dietitian's business. Couple key points is that nutrition research is pretty difficult to conduct. It's hard to do long-term studies that are experimental in nature. The impact of nutrition on health is generally slow, not to suggest that things can't happen rapidly, but the kind of measurable outcomes, for example, changing someone's, gastrointestinal ecosystem, those are things that take time, right? Lots of mixed findings in nutritional epidemiology. And so there's a wide range of different approaches that can work for people. And since everyone eats, people tend to have opinions about food and about health, as they should. But one of the key points from this morning, if you were here, is that we have to be careful about the formation of groups based on nutritional identities, what some people have called nutritional tribalism or toxic tribalism. So when we talk about nutrition for mental health, we have this burgeoning field of nutritional psychiatry, which, from my understanding, is looking more at some of the biological factors, the gut-brain axis, the bidirectional pathways. I've been very interested in neuroinflammation, inflammation that starts in the gut, crosses the blood-brain barrier, reaches the brain. And of course, we have micronutrients for mental health disorders, and I know we have a talk on that later today. And then we have this field of nutritional psychology, and I'm very interested in this because it sort of covers more cognitive processes around food, how we think about food, how we think about our bodies, the experience of living in our body. And I like this revolution a lot because it challenges the calorie model. I've never been big on the calorie model as a way of looking at nutrition. This calorie model is very limited. And I think that when we think about the evolution of nutrition frameworks, this kind of paradigm shift is much needed. We're looking at biopsychosocial mechanisms driving inflammation, impacting the brain and the mind, brain and mind being not the same thing. So historically, in nutrition for mental health, we've looked at, vitamin and mineral deficiencies and how they associate with different mental health conditions, essential fatty acids, omega-3, amino acids, right? Long understood as being precursors for neurotransmitters. And there's been things that we know, right? Trends that we've known, food and mood, emotional eating. But I think here and now, we're much more looking at gut health, the immune system, inflammation, oxidative stress, etc. I do want to point out that, again, this is Australia. Shout out Australia. A recent review of reviews, it says a rapid review of reviews looking at dietary interventions in mental health, found that the outcomes that I'm most interested in, substance use disorders, depression, anxiety, most of the studies are supplementation. And you could probably guess why. These are populations that are difficult to do, longer term controlled research with. It's so much easier to do studies with supplements than it is with food. And I am all about supplements, but I think I do have a strong bias toward eating behavior, relationship with food, actual food, because of food synergy. But again, I am aware of how difficult it is to do that kind of research. So I think we have run into a problem with nutrition for mental health being somewhat of a reductionistic model that looks at single nutrients based on supplement protocols. Once again, I'm very interested in, what we eat, our quote unquote relationship with food. It goes beyond nutrition. It's how we think, right? Our behaviors. And I think that that's an important piece of, this conversation, and certainly relevant for nutrition for depression, right? Like, people just knowing something or taking a pill it doesn't often have the kind of impact that we might be making to look. My perspective is very much life course informed, which means that I'm looking at health more broadly, not looking at 24-hour-a-day nutrition, thinking about how exposures and protective factors at different parts of our life affect later parts of our life, right? So how risk can accumulate over time. A lot of my work has been on early life adversity, and I'm going to share a little bit of that today because it's very strongly associated with depression, depressive symptoms, and with eating behavior. Some of the stuff I talked about earlier today, addiction like eating, eating disorders, etc. So ELA captures various stressors, traumas, and forms of deprivation experienced during the first 18 years. Could be in utero, although, somewhat difficult to study. We have these ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, and then expanded ACEs. These are forms of adversity that can be experienced out in the community, in the schools, etc. Of course, we have things like poor nutrition, exposure to toxins, a lack of cognitively stimulating experiences. We know that these adversities are strongly correlated with social and environmental factors, but they do occur across all levels of SES. And with respect to mental health, it has been said that time does not heal all wounds. I might have touched on this earlier if you were here, but we did a systematic review meta-analysis linking ACEs to BMI in adulthood. And we found that multiple ACEs increase the odds of being in a larger BMI category by about 46%. And so a lot of my work has been an effort to try to understand how stress, trauma, and adversity get underneath the skin, become biologically embedded, alter eating behaviors, and affect various health outcomes. I think we touched on this earlier today, but I'll just revisit it very quickly. When we think about biologically embedding, there are multiple pathways, and we have to put it into social context, looking at social and environmental factors, food environment, and then psychological factors like the experience of weight stigma and dietary restraint. I was very impressed by this model. It's called the latent vulnerability, the theory of latent vulnerability. I like it. It sort of poses this question of how can two people that were exposed to the same form of adversity have such different outcomes, right? So we have genotype, which kind of interacts with the exposure to adversity. We could have some people, that have a higher risk of psychiatric disorder, and those that have more resilient genotypes where they have bounce back, right? And that adversity can actually make someone stronger, certainly more of the exception than the rule. We know that adversity can affect the way reward is processed, and this is generally the dopamine system. We know that adversity can affect the way people register threats. We often use the term hypervigilance, and this is mostly in the amygdala, and then of course the way memories are processed in mostly the hippocampus. So it is very much an interest of mine to think about how first 18 years affect physiology and how that can lead to various mental health mediators and outcomes. I shared a lot this morning about food addictions and eating disorders. A lot of my work is substance use disorders, and all of these boxes are very much linked to depression. So I'm just giving you a little background as we lean into the depression topic of some of the work that I've done and where my theoretical orientation stems from. Great paper. If you're interested in learning more about the biological embedding of childhood adversity, I believe it to be open access. It describes the early psychosocial environment and how critical and sensitive periods, can certainly increase the risk for biological changes. We're looking at changes in brain function, structural and functional and morphological characteristics of the brain. Certainly the HPA axis, which is responsible for the output of cortisol. We've got the immune system, metabolic factors, gut dysbiosis, and then epigenetic changes. Pretty good article from 2017 describing all the potential pathways that can affect someone's developmental trajectory and have a profound impact on their health outcomes. in the paper that we published about childhood sexual abuse, I think I outlined these kind of 4 relevant biological embedding pathways, and I believe that paper is open access as well. So we know that the immune system regulates the inflammatory cascade. We know that early life immune activation sensitizes individuals exposed to trauma to the effects of subsequent stressors. So sometimes the early life trauma makes the later life trauma more difficult. We know that early life adversity increases the production of monocytes and macrophages with strong pro-inflammatory tendencies. So these immune cells are the primary source of cytokines such as interleukins and tumor necrosis factors. From meta-analysis, we know that trauma exposure associates with higher levels of CRP, several interleukins, and TNF alpha. So early life stress activates the immune system, leading to cytokine production, creating low-grade peripheral inflammation. And we know that some of these inflammatory signals are picked up by the brain, at the blood-brain barrier, the microglia. And this can actually lead to what we call neuroinflammation, where, for example, someone might experience real subtle inflammatory cascade in the amygdala, which affects anxiety, depression, craving, leads to higher risk-taking behaviors, including drugs, alcohol, and food. And a lot of this comes from the growing, emerging field of psychoneuroimmunology. And I feel very fortunate to have done my doctorate at UCLA, where a lot of this pioneering work is happening. So most people are aware of the term leaky gut. Some people prefer the term intestinal permeability. I've been very interested in the concept of blood-brain barrier permeability, what some people would call leaky brain. We know that peripheral inflammation is implicated in major psychiatric disorders. As I mentioned, associates with elevated peripheral pro-inflammatory cytokines, which can in turn increase blood-brain barrier permeability. So what are the major risk factors of intestinal permeability? According to a recent systematic review, of all the strongest risk factors, the Western style diet has been identified as one of the key ones. So Western style diet means high amounts of animal-based protein, refined grains, dairy, etc., and much lower fiber, right? That comes from fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, nuts, and seeds. So when fiber's low and people experience a loss of beneficial microbes, we have the oxidative stress cascade, the increased permeability, and a lot of people, I would posit, live in this sort of red circle area. Might not even be aware of it because they've perhaps never even experienced anything much different, right? And so ideally, we want to address this from multiple angles to help increase bacterial diversity, help someone move toward redox balance, find ways to improve the immune system and the mucosal barrier, and live in a place of symbiosis, right? And I've been very fascinated by how trauma and stress can affect gut health and how all of this, might be one of the mediating pathways between, nutrition and mental health. There was actually a paper recently in the Lancet. I don't know how recent, but it described the negative effect of ultra processed food on health as likely being mediated by changes in gut bacteria. So we have multiple pathways which link the gut and the brain bidirectionally: immune system, nervous system, vascular system. Hopefully this information isn't new to you. We all kind of are starting to understand these, pathways, still less clear on, what to do about it. But hopefully today we can share some of those clinical pearls. We know that poor diet leads to chronic oxidative stress, alters redox signaling and neurotransmitter content. And, coming back to my interest, can increase impulsivity, addiction-like behaviors, lead to more cravings, including cravings for food, and thus the cycle continues. So all of these pathways linking the gut and the brain, which, is the microbiota, HPA axis, barrier, permeability, immune system, and the vagus nerve, which we didn't talk about. They're all nutrition related, which means that dietitians, nutrition professionals can all make an impact on improving brain health by way of improving gut health. I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but I want to share it just to let you know that, there has been work done to understand these steps. Okay, so I'll walk us through it briefly. This model that I created looks at the sort of interaction between early life adversity and chronic alcohol. We know that early life trauma increases the risk of addiction and alcohol by several fold, and oftentimes co-occur. So if someone has both early life adversity and chronic alcohol, there are some patterns which are likely to suggest pathways back to relapse, which I'll hopefully elucidate. So once someone has had early life adversity, it can change the gut, which can affect intestinal permeability. And then once we start adding in the alcohol, we have direct pathways to anxiety, depression, and craving, but we also have pathways through gut-derived immune activation. So what we know about alcohol is that a lot of its negative biological effects, particularly on the liver, don't come from the direct effects of alcohol on the liver, but more so the direct effects of alcohol on the gut, which, can affect the immune system and lead to inflammatory cascades that kick off in the liver and can be circulated throughout the body, crossing the blood-brain barrier, leading to quote-unquote leaky brain, neuroinflammation, and that might be, occurring in the amygdala, among other places, all of which can increase anxiety, depression, and craving, and then lead to relapse. So yes, people that have early life adversity and addictions tend to fare worse in terms of treatment outcomes. And I've actually heard the argument made that all people with addictions have some form of underlying stress, trauma, and adversity. And this is certainly relevant to depression, where we are headed now. Depression is a mood disorder. You've probably heard the term major depressive disorder, which is also referred to as clinical depression. There are depressive symptoms, which, isn't necessarily the same as depression. These are things that we capture in research. So using the CESD, the PHQ-9, these are very well-established instruments to capture depressive symptoms. They don't necessarily capture depression. They capture the depressive symptoms, okay? And you can make some assumptions that if someone is above a certain cut point, they're likely to have clinical depression, but capturing something on a research tool is not the same as having it be diagnosed by a healthcare professional. And then, you might see terms like, unipolar versus bipolar. Bipolar formerly being known as manic depression, which is associated with the swings or the mania. There's been some effort to understand how nutraceuticals and phytoceuticals can be helpful to a wide range of psychiatric disorders. And I just want to highlight from this publication, once again, this is Canada, not so much the US. And I always just notice that this conversation that we're trying to have here today just is much, much slower in the US compared to Canada, certain parts of South America, Australia, and the UK. These are some of the supplements that can be helpful for depression. They did a pretty deep dive into the literature. So you're seeing vitamin D, zinc, methylated folate compounds, curcumin, which comes from turmeric, omega-3, saffron, probiotics, and St. John's wort. And I can say that these are all supplements that I use clinically. I do tend to, stay away from St. John's wort because it has potential interactions with medications. As someone that works in the nutrition for mental health space, I'm very cautious about recommending anything that has the potential for harm. So I generally stay away from any supplements that have known interactions with medications. Even if someone's not on one of those medications, maybe they would start one of them one day after we're done working together. So I have a bias towards safety, which I hope some people can appreciate. Um, when we don't have evidence-based treatment, we tend to go with treatment-based evidence. We know that most people report that eating less processed foods, which we talked about today, and more whole foods improves wellness and mood. And this impact is more pronounced in some. In other words, there are people that can change the way they eat and not have like a profound change in their reaction to life, right? And there's other people that can, start eating high fiber, high antioxidant foods and have a revolution in their life and be like, I can't believe that I feel this way and never knew it was even possible, right? So everyone's biology is a little bit different. We've known, with phrases like you are what you eat, that this stuff matters, but we never really knew why. Until now, we know that many highly processed foods have ingredients that negatively impact gut microbiota, and that in turn affects mental health. Depression is linked to diet. Hopefully you've picked up on some of that today. It's clinically relevant to food addiction, substance use disorders, and eating disorders in a bidirectional fashion, which means that we know highly palatable foods reduce negative affect, and we know that low quality foods can increase depressive symptoms, right? So it's moving in a circular and continuous fashion. There's a lot of associational studies, and we do have some longitudinal data that suggests ultra-processed food consumption does increase the risk of developing depression at later time points. And of all the different nutritional approaches, it is, pretty clear that the Mediterranean style of eating has the most established evidence base for reducing depressive symptoms. It's probably not the prettiest slide I've ever put together, but I wanted to throw in a recent systematic review and dose response meta-analysis linking ultra-processed food to adult mental health disorders. Results suggest that ultra-processed food consumption is associated with an increased risk of depression, but not anxiety. Okay, so I have been interested in nutrition for anxiety. There are certainly some supplements there, but overall, the weight of the evidence with respect to dietary interventions, supplements, including things like probiotics, that the impact of nutrition on depression is way more documented and noticeable than the impact on anxiety. And I really think this is important because it highlights that there are different phenotypes of depression. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, but it's been made pretty clear in recent years that there is the inflammatory phenotype of depression. And it's been my experience that that's the individual that'll respond most to a nutrition intervention. So once again, this was a different meta-analysis of RCTs. Dietary interventions significantly reduced depressive symptoms, but there wasn't a statistically significant effect for anxiety. And this is important because depression and anxiety often cluster and co-occur. Again, I shared this briefly this morning, but I just want to come back and wave the Australian flag and, really point to this systematic review that looked at the 7 RTCs to date. 7 out of 7 found positive outcomes with depression levels with depression levels decreasing after dietary intervention. Now, what I really liked about this systematic review is that none of these studies were focused on weight. We know that BMI and depression are a correlate. These were actual studies that were designed to help improve depressive symptoms, not studies that were weight loss studies, right? And I think I just want to make the call, like we need more of this. We need more funding for studies that are really focused on different outcomes, such as depression, et cetera. And, generally these were diets that promote more whole foods, right? That's what we're talking about. More fiber, more antioxidants, good quality protein, and then decreasing the intake of processed and high fat foods. And you heard me talk this morning, hopefully, about disordered eating and eating disorders. And, I am an eating disorder professional, and this is where things get tricky, right? It's like, we know that the best course of treatment for depression is less ultra processed foods and more whole foods. But what if someone also is on an eating disorder continuum or spectrum? This is where that clinical intuition comes into play. I mean, it's pretty clear that with restrictive eating disorders, telling someone to eat less processed foods and more whole foods can actually make someone worse. So yeah, I would say that with ultra processed foods, the weight of the evidence shows that ultra processed foods are, um, you know, negatively correlated with mental health outcomes. I think it's safe to say that reducing ultra processed foods will be beneficial for most mental health outcomes. And I would say that some of the exceptions can include some forms of eating disorders, perhaps some people with some forms of OCD that cluster with orthorexia nervosa, people that have a tendency to take this information and go too far, right? So I don't think that we need to say it's either this or that. The question is like, what if someone has a restrictive eating disorder and has depression? How do we treat that person? And hopefully you got from this morning that I'm very interested in these intersection areas and how we can create messaging that's nuanced and individualized. Symptoms of depression include depressed mood, anhedonia, and inability to feel pleasure, feelings of worthlessness or guilt, suicidal ideation, fatigue, loss of energy. It could be a sleep decrease or a sleep increase, weight or appetite decrease or increase, and then a decreased ability to think or concentrate, and psychomotor agitation. We're going to get into some of the biological pathways associated with depression. The primary basis for antidepressant medications that operate on the serotonin system is generated from the monoamine hypothesis. We also have other biologically relevant pathways such as the HPA axis, responsible for the stress response via cortisol. We've got neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, which facilitates resilience against stress, inflammation, which is the hot topic, structural and functional brain changes that are measured through neuroimaging, MRI, et cetera. We've got genetics, and it's never just one gene. With mental health, we tend to usually look at multiple genes, which we call polygenic, and then epigenetics, which is the modification of genes that don't alter the genetic code itself. So when we start thinking about the potential mechanisms linking depression and diet, we've got the gut microbiota, as we know, the collection of microbes that colonize the GI tract. We've got oxidative stress, which is related to inflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction, which is responsible for energy production. This tryptophan kynurenine metabolism pathway is starting to get some attention. This is related to the monoamine hypothesis and sort of coming back to the neurotransmitter serotonin, and then the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the BDNF, which is related to synaptic plasticity. So I'm going to cite a paper from 2020, Marks et al., Diet and Depression, Exploring the Biological Mechanisms. This sort of just maps out the benefits of whole food health, quote unquote, healthy diets that have more phytochemicals, naturally occurring vitamins and minerals, the right kinds of fats, and the right kinds of fiber. All of these do have potential effects on these pathways: the HPA axis, oxidative stress, inflammation, gut, and epigenetics. And some of these correlate with each other. And yeah, there's a lot of next steps by way of neurogenesis, mitochondria, this tryptophan kynurenine pathway, all of which have great potential to alleviate depression. Now, I would make the argument that, once again, nutrition is slow. These aren't the kind of things that would happen, in a week, right? We're looking more like months, maybe even a year. People can feel better quickly, but I just mean to change biology with food is not an easy task, right? And I would say that, in order to get the kind of results that I think people are looking for, if you just did one of these things, like you added a fiber pill, or you added a phytochemical supplement or a vitamin, or you just started taking some omega-3, and if you just did one of these things, I'm not convinced that it will have the kind of effect that we're looking for. I think we need to do all of these things, right, in order to change the biology in a favor that could actually impact the brain and affect someone's experience with life. This is another paper that really maps out the characteristics of the Mediterranean diet and the mechanisms by which, it can improve depressive symptoms. Once again, same characteristics. We're looking at high fiber fruits and vegetables with a lot of antioxidants, the right kinds of fats from things like olive oil, avocados, nuts, fish, omega-3, and then of course, the other pillars of health, exercise, social support, love, right? So yes, lots of potential pathways here with inflammation, with cortisol, with vitamins, and then neuronal activity. I don't want to say that all of these pathways are fully mapped out, right? I'm not convinced that we understand all of these things, but we're starting to develop some pretty strong theories about why there are such, marked associations between diet and depression in the literature. And I just think that this is such an important conversation because most people still link nutrition to fitness and, muscles and body fat. And, I think it's so important to shift the narrative, to move away from the quantitative aspects of nutrition, move toward the qualitative aspects, get people to stop focusing on fat and muscles and start focusing on the gut and the brain, right? That's the nutrition for mental health revolution. Yeah, someone's listing more pathways. There's so much more. There's so much more that needs to be elucidated for sure. And I'm just so excited to see some of this research happening. And I really wish we could do more in the US. And I think the reasons why we're not might be obvious to some. And hopefully if you were there this morning, you understand where I stand on some of these things. Big fan of fiber. I think if someone's been on the Western diet, low fiber for a long time, it can be difficult for them to move into a nutrition intervention. I think it can be challenging for someone to reintroduce fiber and start eating, beans or things like that if they've never really eaten them before. So I think that chronic low fiber creates a barrier for nutrition therapy. Okay, so one of the things I've tried to do is just move people slowly, increasing their fiber over time to get to some of those fiber targets. And of course, digestive enzymes, probiotics, and other gut-based supplements can be helpful. But generally, I like to recommend getting fiber from food rather than supplements. I do think there are reasonable other products out there. I'm a big fan of chia seeds soaked in water. I know they're not good for everyone. But yeah, emphasizing fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, nuts, and seeds, getting some of those in the raw form, helping people eat a wide range of plant foods on a daily basis. For example, getting a fruit or vegetable with every meal or snack. And everyone sort of learned at some point about the value of colors in food. And I'm obsessed with it. I think it's the way forward. In other words, getting people to stop counting their calories and start counting their colors. Let's go. And then we've all seen these lists of prebiotic foods, right? It's funny if you look at this list, you're like, oh yeah, these are the foods that have, the fibers that the bacteria want to thrive on. And you give this to one of your clients or patients and they're like, yeah, I went to the store. They didn't have any artichokes or okra or dandelion greens, but I appreciate the list. But yeah, some of these foods are less easy to find, some more common. And once again, I don't think that just adding one of these foods to a regimen is going to kickstart a revolution. But I think if you do all of these things in conjunction with some patience and you do it gradually over time, we can start to make some biological shifts that have some downstream effects on mental health. And it's not just the fibers, it's the polyphenols that are in foods. As you may recall learning, a phenol is a stable 6-carbon benzene ring that can donate an electron, which helps scavenge free radicals, hence the term antioxidant. And so polyphenol has many of these phenolic compounds with sometimes very complex and diverse structures. So it has been shown that gut bacteria tend to prefer polyphenols, okay? So it isn't just the fiber that's in these foods, it's the antioxidant compounds that are associated with the hues in the food, the colors, and that gut bacteria the positive ones tend to proliferate based on the presence of fiber and polyphenols, which in my opinion really reinforces the importance of eating real food. And this is known as food synergy. So taking a fiber supplement and a polyphenol supplement will not be able to be as impactful as eating the actual food itself. Okay. So the active ingredient in raspberries is raspberries, right? And so there's a wide range of polyphenols. The most commonly known ones are in the flavonoid family. Most of you have heard of quercetin, which you can find in the skin of apples. I'm a big fan of the skins, by the way. Yeah, we eat the skins, the kiwi skin. A lot of potent stuff in there that gut bacteria tend to prefer. Resveratrol is common as well. And then, of course, our fermented foods. I mean, if you're at this conference, you've heard all this stuff today, right? I don't need to tell you about fermented foods, okay? But the point is it is a ingredient in the nutrition intervention that can be helpful to alleviate symptoms of depression and can be effective if done in conjunction with all the other things we're talking about with Mediterranean style eating, the right kinds of fats, the fibers, the colors. And it's so much easier said than done. If you work in nutrition and counseling, you know that telling someone what to do and helping them make the necessary changes to do it are very different things. And I believe that, there's a wide range of reasons why nutrition intervention through counseling is difficult. One of them is, just the fact that, human beings are creatures of habit and, it's difficult to make changes. I also believe that food addiction plays a role. I do. I think that, ultra processed food addiction plays a role in calibrating the reward expectancy that people have from food, and changing their food is very difficult because the beneficial food gives them less dopamine, and therefore the brain doesn't assign it as much value. And then the other reason that I think it's difficult for people to change what they eat is because I don't think people really, really believe that it's going to make a big difference, right? Because we haven't done a good job enough as educators to really teach people about these mechanisms and to really help people understand that nutrition can have a profound effect on mental health. And if you think about like the amount of money that some people pay for therapy, right? I often use that, in a session with someone. Like, you could get like, a vegetable juice a day for a month for the same price of like one expensive therapy session. You know what I mean? And then people are like, oh, I understand. I see what you're saying. And yeah, we like to drop a little olive oil into the vegetable juice too to get the fats for the fat soluble vitamins. Let's go. The best anti-inflammatory foods are listed here. You've probably seen lists like this. We're just looking at colorful, fibrous fruits and vegetables, fatty fish, etc. And I think that, if people can get moving in this direction and do so in a way that's not disordered, not orthorexic, we can move the needle a little bit on depression and depressive symptoms. We talked a little bit about probiotics, but I just wanted to include some of the evidence here. Some of these are systematic reviews looking at, improved mental health outcomes. And once again, it does seem like probiotics have a much more pronounced effect on depression compared to anxiety. And I don't think we'll ever get to a place where we're able to say these are the single strains that are good for these conditions, because everyone's gut ecosystem is so different. It's also important to acknowledge that a lot of people with depression are on medications, and there's been some really great work out of Ireland. Dinnan and Cryan have really pioneered work at the intersection of gut microbiome and medications, with evidence that supports the notion that microbes are actually metabolizing drugs and vice versa. And that, drugs can modify the gut microbiota. So when we think about, behavioral health, gut-brain access, we have to think about, alcohol and drugs, which is, one of my areas of interest. And then, of course, the antipsychotics, antidepressants, et cetera. All of these things can have profound effects on gut bacteria. I believe, and, there's some evidence to support this, but I'm going to go out on a limb. Okay. And this isn't true for all medications, but I believe that some of the weight gain associated with some medications has to do with the loss of beneficial microbes. I think that's the mechanism. I do. Not for all of them, but for some of them, the weight gain might come from a loss of beneficial species. Okay. So yes, welcome to the future of behavioral health. The future is now. Recent paper says toward new nutritional policies for brain health, a research perspective on future actions. Let's go. Healthy food is for all is a responsibility of policy and requires public funding. We need to increase the scientific evidence to identify nutrients that impact brain health. Perhaps we'll hear more about that this afternoon. We need to identify the neuronal circuit, cells, and molecules linking nutrition with brain health. There's still some gaps here, okay? We need to bridge basic science mechanisms to clinical outcomes by identifying biomarkers. We need to produce effective messages concerning the role of food for brain health, implementing dietary recommendations, personalizing nutrition, and improving nutrition education. Nutrition education hasn't always proven to be that high impact, but I can tell you, I've ran some groups in my team. We've run some groups in mental health settings where we talk about this stuff. And we're talking about high impact, life-changing stuff because a lot of times what we're doing is just cognitive restructuring, giving people new frameworks, new ways to think about nutrition to move out of the old and into the new. We see what we see on the surface. We see the leaves and we see the branches. These are, the conditions that occur with the human experience, the negative health outcomes. But in functional medicine, we try to go beyond the leaves and the branches and get to the root to understand what might be the underlying driving factors. And then in public health, we go beyond the root and we want to look at the soil, the entire contextual factors that influence health outcomes, starting at the population level, coming to the individual. And this is what we call the social determinants of health, which could never be ignored in any conversation around health and particularly mental health. And I'd like to add that food for thought is no substitute for the real thing. What you eat matters. It matters more for some people than for others. Being too concerned with what you eat is a mental health problem. And I didn't talk a lot about eating disorders in this conversation today. I talked about it a lot this morning, but I do want to recognize that, recommending less processed foods and more whole foods is not appropriate for all people. However, there are ways to move people toward thinking about food differently so that it's not activating risk for disordered eating. In other words, moving people away from calories, moving people away from macronutrients, moving people away from fitness apps, weighing and measuring food, and just trying to think about using food to improve cognition, to improve memory, to create a sense of safety in their body, to improve relational health, to improve sleep, and essentially improve quality of life, right? And that's the message that's missing and that we need. And I hope that some of the attendees today can step up and be a part of this important message that needs to be carried. And there I am again,